Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into how frontier families survived the coldest winter nights, stepping carefully into a small wooden cabin somewhere along the northern plains in the late 19th century, where warmth depended not on machines or switches, but on memory, patience, and the careful tending of ordinary things. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's slowly step into the past. Softly, gently, together. You step outside just before the last of the daylight begins to thin across the open snow, and the first thing you notice is the sound beneath your boots. It is not quite a crunch. It is sharper than that. The snow answers each step with a small, dry squeak, the kind that only appears when the air has grown truly cold. Frontier families learned to listen for that sound without thinking. It meant the temperature was dropping quickly now, and the night would not be gentle. Across the clearing, the sky is already turning pale and metallic, as if the light itself is beginning to harden. Inside the cabin behind you, the fire is still awake, but not yet prepared for the long hours ahead. A winter night here is not something you wait for. It is something you prepare for, quietly and steadily, before it arrives. So you gather wood, not all at once and not carelessly. Each piece is chosen with a kind of calm attention that comes from repetition. Pine goes closest to the door, where it can be reached quickly if the flames begin to fade early. Oak is stacked just inside the threshold, heavier and slower to burn, and somewhere within easy reach of the stove, there will already be a few pieces of hickory waiting for the deepest part of the night, when nobody wishes to leave their blankets. Many families across the northern plains followed this quiet sorting habit, even when they did not speak of it directly. The wrong wood at the wrong hour could mean rising from bed too soon, or losing warmth that could not easily be replaced before morning. Elias is standing near the doorway now, brushing loose snow from a log before bringing it inside. He pauses only once, tilting the wood slightly in his hands as if weighing it. Then he nods to himself and carries it through the door. It is the sort of movement he has repeated so often that it no longer feels like a decision at all. Behind him, the air is already changing. Cold moves differently in the evening than it does in the morning. It arrives slowly, almost politely at first, slipping through the trees and across the open ground, like a low tide returning to shore. Frontier families did not measure this change with instruments. They measured it with breath, with sound, and with the way the snow answered their footsteps. Sometimes, when the air grew this still, people joked quietly that even their mustaches froze before they finished speaking. It was not entirely a joke. You carry another armful of wood toward the cabin, and when the door opens, the warmth inside meets your face in a narrow band that reaches only a few steps into the yard. Beyond that invisible edge, the cold still waits patiently. Inside, the light is already softer. Marta has begun bringing smaller pieces of kindling closer to the stove, arranging them where they can be reached without standing up later. She does this without hurry. Every movement is slow, careful, and deliberate, as though she is setting the room in order for someone who will wake long before dawn. On a nearby shelf, a bucket stands ready to be filled with clean snow before night deepens further. Water left standing indoors often froze by morning during the coldest weeks of winter, and melting snow early in the evening saved both effort and discomfort later. Even small preparations like this made the difference between sleeping peacefully and waking to unnecessary trouble. Outside again, The snow reflects what remains of the sky's pale brightness so strongly that the clearing almost seems to glow. Travelers sometimes walked short distances at night without a lamp when the snow lay fresh like this, trusting the ground itself to return enough light for their steps. You pause for a moment before the doorway, listening. The wind has not yet risen. That is a good sign. Still air allows warmth to remain closer to the cabin walls once darkness settles. A moving wind would pull it away much more quickly. Elias sets the last of the evening wood inside the threshold and closes the door firmly behind him. The latch makes a small, familiar sound, and already the outside world feels farther away than it did only a few minutes earlier. The night has not begun yet, but everything inside the cabin is quietly preparing for it. Soon, the fire will need to last longer than anyone intends to stay awake. You begin to notice as the evening settles deeper around the cabin that not all wood is meant for the same hour of the night. Some pieces are quick and lively, meant to wake a flame that has nearly disappeared. Others burn slowly and steadily, almost as if they understand how long darkness can last in winter. And a few are saved carefully for the hours when everyone inside the house is asleep, when the fire must continue working without help. Frontier families learned these differences not from books, but from years of listening to the stove. Near the doorway, where the cold still lingers faintly along the floorboards, a small row of pale pine sticks rests within easy reach. Pine lights quickly. It catches flame with very little encouragement, especially when the air inside the stove has grown thin and quiet. When a coal begins to fade during the night, pine can bring it back to life with only a few careful movements. Closer to the stove itself, heavier pieces of oak wait in a separate stack. Oak does not hurry. It burns with a calm steadiness that keeps warmth in the room rather than sending it racing upward through the chimney. Families often depended on oak during the long middle hours of darkness, when nobody wished to wake fully, but everyone still depended on the fire. And somewhere nearby, perhaps wrapped loosely in cloth or placed slightly apart from the rest, there are one or two pieces of hickory. Hickory was often saved for the coldest stretch before dawn. It burned slowly enough that a single piece could remain alive in the stove long after the room had grown silent. People sometimes spoke of hickory as though it were patient wood, willing to keep watch while the household slept. That quiet patience made it especially valuable during the deepest hours of winter night. Thomas kneels beside the stove now, turning one short log in his hands before setting it carefully into place near the hearthstones. He does not choose at random. He lifts each piece once, feeling its weight, and sometimes taps it lightly against another log to hear the sound it makes. Dense wood answers with a deeper tone. Lighter wood sounds hollow and quick. These small tests take only a few seconds, but they help him decide where each piece belongs in the evening's arrangement. Inside a frontier cabin, wood was not simply stored, it was staged. A narrow line of kindling sits closest to the stove door, where it can be reached even in darkness. Slightly larger sticks rest beside them, ready to follow once the first sparks begin to grow. Behind those, the thicker logs wait quietly, each one placed so that it can be lifted without stepping onto the colder boards farther from the fire. This careful ordering allowed someone half awake to tend the stove without fully rising from bed. You move a little closer to the warmth now, and the change is easy to feel. Only a few steps nearer the stove, the air becomes softer against your face. Just beyond that circle, the cold still lingers in the corners of the room, patient and unmoving. Many families learn to arrange their evening wood within that warmer circle before lying down. It was a small effort made once, so that greater effort would not be needed later. Along the wall beside the door, another short stack waits for morning use. Bringing wood indoors before nightfall protected it from drifting snow and freezing wind. Dry wood burned more reliably, and reliability mattered more than speed when the temperature outside fell far below comfort. Sometimes, when storms lasted longer than expected, these indoor reserves became the difference between sleeping calmly and waking repeatedly to coax the fire back to life. In settlements scattered across the northern plains during the late 1800s, people often spoke quietly about the danger of running out of dry wood during a storm that lasted several days. Roads disappeared under snow. Paths between cabins vanished. Even familiar landmarks could fade into a white silence that made travel uncertain. So wood placed indoors before nightfall was more than convenience. It was reassurance. Thomas finishes arranging the last of the shorter pieces beside the stove and brushes his hands together, sending a faint dust of bark onto the floorboards. He glances once toward the door, where the heavier reserve stack waits, and then toward the stove again, as if measuring the distance between them without thinking. That distance matters. The closer the wood stands to the warmth, the easier it will be to reach when the fire begins to fade in the night. The farther it stands, the more courage it takes to leave blankets and step across the colder boards to retrieve it. Families rarely spoke about this choice directly, but they arranged their cabins around it every evening. Somewhere outside, the light has thinned even further now. The snow beyond the window holds only a faint reflection of the sky, and the edges of the clearing are beginning to disappear into shadow. Inside the cabin, the small stacks of wood beside the stove seem almost like quiet companions waiting their turn to help the night pass safely. You begin to understand that warmth here is never accidental. It is placed carefully, piece by piece, within reach of sleeping hands. Outside the cabin, the snow does not simply lie where it has fallen. It becomes part of the house. You step carefully along the wall where the wind has drifted loose powder into soft ridges that gather against the logs. At first glance, the snow looks like something to clear away, but frontier families often left these low white banks in place, shaping them gently with boots and shovels until they formed a quiet barrier around the base of the cabin. Snow, when it settles deeply enough, holds small pockets of still air inside it. Those tiny pockets slow the movement of cold wind across the wooden walls. Over time, people learned that a carefully packed snowbank could make the cabin feel calmer inside, even when the temperature outside continued to fall. So instead of sweeping the snow away from the walls, they sometimes brought more of it closer. Marta is already outside, her boots pressing soft patterns into the drift beside the doorway. She bends slightly and gathers loose snow in her mittened hands, pushing it gently against the lower edge of the logs. The movement is slow and patient, almost like smoothing cloth across a table. She is not building a wall. She is shaping a cushion. Across many winter settlements in the northern plains and forested frontier regions, families used this same habit without needing to describe it in technical language. They simply noticed that cabins surrounded by packed snow stayed quieter inside during long nights of wind. You walk a little farther along the outer wall and notice how the snow lies thicker on the side facing the open clearing. That is where the wind usually arrives first. By pressing the snow more firmly in that direction, the cabin gains a small measure of protection that lasts until the next thaw. The work takes only a few minutes, but the effect can last all night. Above you, the sky is already deepening into a pale blue that almost feels solid. Winter evenings often carry a strange brightness, even after the sun disappears, especially when fresh snow covers the ground. Light does not vanish all at once here. It lingers softly, returning from the surface of the snow in quiet reflections that stretch across the clearing. Travelers sometimes depended on that reflected light when moving between cabins after dark. Even without a lantern, the snow itself could guide careful footsteps along familiar paths. The ground seemed to remember the day's brightness a little longer than the sky did. You pause beside a shallow drift where the snow has gathered clean and untouched near the edge of the clearing. This is the kind of snow people preferred for melting into water later in the evening. Snow too close to the cabin walls often carried ash from the chimney or traces from passing boots. Snow near animal shelters could carry other things best left outside. So families learned to choose carefully. Fresh snow from open ground melted into clearer water, though it took more than a full bucket of snow to make even a small pot of liquid. People understood this without measuring it. They simply knew that melting snow required patience and that bringing it indoors early made the night easier. Inside the cabin, a bucket stands waiting near the stove for exactly this purpose. You gather a small armful of snow now, lifting it gently so it does not scatter in the air, and carry it toward the doorway. Even this simple task becomes part of the evening's preparation. Once the fire settles into its slower rhythm later in the night, nobody will want to step outside again unless they must. The door opens briefly, and warmth touches your face before fading again as it closes behind you. Already, the outside world feels farther away than it did only a short time ago. Beyond the window, the clearing continues to glow faintly. Snow reflects the last traces of light in a way that almost resembles distant starlight resting on the ground. It is not bright enough to read by, but it is bright enough to remind you where the edges of the world still are. In some places across the frontier, people spoke quietly about winter nights when the snow shone so clearly that they could walk between neighboring cabins without carrying a lamp. The ground itself seemed to hold a memory of daylight, returning it slowly after sunset. Marta finishes pressing the last of the loose snow against the lower wall and steps back to look at her work. The cabin stands quietly within its pale boundary now, as if wrapped in a soft outer layer that did not exist only an hour earlier. This small change does not stop the cold entirely, but it slows it. And sometimes, slowing the cold is enough. You brush the remaining snow from your gloves and look once more across the clearing before turning back toward the door. The sky above has darkened another shade, and the brightness on the ground is beginning to soften into silver instead of blue. Inside, the stove continues its steady breathing. Outside, the snow has already begun helping the cabin keep its warmth a little longer than it could have on its own. When you step back inside the cabin, the change in air feels immediate and gentle, like moving closer to a bowl of soup that has just begun to steam. The warmth is not everywhere. It gathers mostly around the stove. Only a few steps from the door, you can already feel the difference. Near the stove, the air softens against your face and hands. Farther away, along the outer walls, the boards still hold a quiet chill that has not yet disappeared. Frontier families learned to notice this invisible boundary early in winter. They did not measure it with numbers, but they could feel it easily enough. There was often a small circle of comfort around the stove, no wider than a few long steps across. Everything important for the night had to be placed within that circle. A bucket of snow stands near the hearthstones now, beginning to sink slowly as the lower layers soften into water. Snow melts quietly when left beside steady warmth, but it takes time. Bringing it indoors before darkness deepened meant there would be water ready later, without anyone needing to step outside again. You move closer and notice how the top of the snow still holds its shape, while the bottom has already begun to settle. People across the northern frontier understood this slow change without watching it closely. They simply returned to the bucket now and then, adding another handful of snow until enough water gathered at the bottom. Near the stove door, Marta has already placed a small row of thin sticks where they can be reached without standing. These are not meant for the evening fire. They are meant for later, when someone wakes only halfway and needs to wake the embers without letting the room grow cold. Such arrangements were made almost without speaking. Each piece of kindling rests close enough to the stove that it feels faintly warm to the touch. That warmth matters. Wood brought too close too early might dry and crack. Wood left too far away might feel stiff with frost when lifted in the middle of the night. So families learned to place their kindling somewhere between those two conditions, where it stayed ready without becoming brittle. Thomas kneels beside the hearth now, turning one of the smallest sticks in his hands before sliding it a little closer to the stove leg. He tests the distance the way someone might test the warmth of bread near an oven door. Not too near, not too far. The work is quiet, but it changes the night ahead. Along the wall near the sleeping place, another small group of logs waits within reach of the blankets. These are not the largest pieces. They are the pieces most likely to be used without fully waking. Someone lying half asleep can stretch an arm toward them, add one to the stove, and settle back again without stepping across the colder boards near the doorway. This simple arrangement allowed warmth to continue through the night with as little movement as possible. Even the placement of boots follows this same careful thinking. You notice a pair resting near the stove, turned slightly outward so they can be slipped on quickly if needed. Boots left too far from warmth sometimes stiffened overnight. Leather could grow unyielding in deep cold, making early morning movement slow and uncomfortable. Keeping them within the gentle edge of the stove's warmth helped them remain flexible enough for use before sunrise. On a narrow shelf beside the wall, a small lamp waits quietly. Oil for that lamp is used carefully during winter months. Light after dark was never taken for granted. Families often planned their evening movements so that as little lamp oil as possible would be needed before morning. A steady fire provided warmth, but it also provided enough glow to move safely within the room. Beyond the reach of that glow, the corners of the cabin already feel deeper and stiller. You glance toward the window and see that the pale brightness outside has softened further. The snow beyond the glass no longer reflects the sky as strongly as it did earlier. Night is settling more completely now. Marta checks the edge of the window covering once more, pressing the quilt gently where it meets the frame. Even a narrow opening could allow a thin thread of cold air to move slowly into the room. These small checks were repeated many times during winter evenings, not because something had gone wrong, but because careful attention prevented trouble before it began. Near the stove, the bucket of snow has changed again. A shallow pool of water now rests at the bottom, dark and still. By morning, it will be ready for cooking or washing without anyone needing to step outside into the cold. Thomas rises from his place beside the hearth and steps back once, looking at the arrangement he has made. The smallest sticks rest closest. The medium pieces stand behind them. The heavier logs wait farther back, but still within reach of the warmer boards near the stove. Nothing here has been placed by accident. The warmth inside this small circle will carry the household through the night, but only if everything needed to tend, it remains close at hand. As the last of the evening light fades beyond the window covering, the cabin grows quieter still. The fire settles into a steady rhythm, neither too bright nor too faint. The snow outside rests softly against the walls. And inside, every object that might be needed before morning now waits within the reach of sleeping hands. Soon, the embers themselves will have to continue the work that daylight has left behind. You begin to notice the walls only after you have been inside the cabin long enough to stop thinking about the cold outside. At first, they seem simple. Rough logs, stacked one above another, holding up the roof and keeping out the wind. But as the evening settles deeper and the fire finds its steady rhythm, the walls begin to feel less like barriers and more like something quietly working around you. Frontier cabins were never perfectly sealed. They were adjusted slowly, season after season, as families learned where the wind preferred to travel and where the warmth tended to escape. Each winter revealed new places where attention was needed. Each spring offered time to repair them. So a cabin was never truly finished. It was cared for. You run your fingers lightly along the surface of one of the interior logs and feel the faint ridges left by tools that shaped it years earlier. These marks are not decorative. They are reminders that every piece of wood was chosen, lifted, and fitted into place by hand. Thick logs slowed the movement of cold air more effectively than thin boards. People understood this without needing measurements. They simply noticed that cabins built from heavier timber felt quieter inside when the wind rose outside. Between the logs, narrow seams remain visible even after careful fitting. Those seams are not mistakes. They are spaces meant to be filled. Elias stands near one corner now, holding a small bundle of dried moss he gathered earlier in the season. He presses it gently into a narrow gap between two logs, using his fingers first and then the smooth handle of a wooden tool to settle it more firmly into place. This work does not take long, but it changes the room. Moss traps small pockets of still air within its fibers. When pressed into the seams between logs, it slows the movement of colder air that might otherwise slip quietly through the wall. Families across forested frontier regions used moss this way for generations, often gathering it during late summer so it would be ready before winter returned. Once the moss is in place, Elias smooths it with a final careful movement and steps back to look along the wall. He is not searching for perfection. He is listening for stillness. In some cabins, people could feel thin threads of cold air moving through gaps they had not yet sealed. They learned to recognize those faint currents against their cheeks or hands. Closing such openings did not make the cabin warm all at once, but it made the warmth steadier. Corners required even more attention. Where two walls met, the logs were cut so that their ends crossed one another in careful patterns that helped block the wind. These corner joints were shaped slowly during construction, but they were also checked again and again during winter months. Even a small shift in the wood could open a narrow path for moving air, so corners were watched closely. You step nearer to one now and notice how the overlapping ends of the logs fit together like branches woven into a sheltering place. Animal nests often rely on the same quiet layering, each piece supporting the next, until the inside becomes calmer than the outside. Cabin builders understood this kind of layering without needing to name it. Along the lower edge of the wall, near the floorboards, another line of moss has already been pressed into place earlier in the season. This area mattered especially during deep winter nights, when cold air settled close to the ground. Sealing the lower seams helped keep that heavier cold from spreading across the room. Sometimes families returned to these seams many times during a single winter. Wood shifts slightly as temperatures change. A gap that did not exist in early autumn might appear by midwinter. When that happened, people simply filled it again. Marta passes nearby carrying a folded cloth and pauses briefly to run her hand along one section of wall. She does not speak, but the movement tells you she is checking for the same quiet currents Elias has been watching for. This kind of attention was part of daily life in frontier cabins. Warmth did not come only from the fire. It came from the patience of small adjustments made over many evenings like this one. Even the thickness of the logs themselves played a role that families could feel without explaining. Heavy timber slowed the change of temperature inside the cabin. When the fire burned strongly, the warmth remained longer. When the fire faded slightly, the room cooled more slowly than it would have in a thinner structure. This gentle delay gave people time. Time to add another log. Time to settle deeper into blankets. Time to sleep without waking too quickly from the cold. Elias finishes pressing the last strand of moss into place and brushes his hands together once, letting the loose fragments fall to the floorboards. The wall beside him looks almost unchanged, but the air near it feels quieter now, less restless than before. Outside, the snow continues to rest softly against the lower logs. Inside, the cabin holds its warmth a little more carefully than it did an hour earlier. And as the fire settles deeper into its steady breathing, you begin to understand that these walls are not only standing around the family, they are quietly helping the night pass more gently than it otherwise would. As the fire continues its steady breathing in the stove, your attention begins to settle again along the walls, but this time not on the logs themselves. Instead, you begin to notice what rests between them. The narrow seams that earlier held soft moss are only part of the story. In many frontier cabins, those seams were strengthened with a second layer made from earth gathered close to the house itself. Clay from the ground, mixed with small fibers or animal hair, formed a firm seal once pressed into place and allowed to dry slowly along the wood. People did not speak of this as construction in the modern sense. They thought of it more like clothing for the house. Clay-filled spaces that moss alone could not close. Hair from livestock helped hold the mixture together as it dried. Sometimes short plant fibers were added as well, especially when they were easy to gather during late summer or autumn. These mixtures formed a thin, protective surface that kept moving air from slipping quietly through the wall during winter nights. You move closer to one section near the window and see where this layer has been smoothed carefully into the seam. The surface is not perfectly flat. It carries faint marks from the fingers that shaped it, small ridges that remain visible even after drying. Such marks were common. They were not signs of unfinished work. They were signs of care. Marta is standing near that same window now, holding a small piece of prepared clay mixture wrapped in cloth to keep it from drying too quickly. She presses it gently into a narrow opening that has appeared along the edge of the frame. The movement is slow and practiced, almost like smoothing dough along the edge of a baking board. Cracks like this often appeared after the first weeks of cold weather. Wood changes slightly as temperatures fall. Logs shrink just enough to open thin lines where earlier there had been none. Families watched for those changes and sealed them again when they appeared. This quiet attention helped the cabin remain steady through the long months of winter. You notice how Marta pauses once, pressing the clay more firmly with the side of her thumb before smoothing the surface flat. When she steps back, the seam looks almost unchanged from the rest of the wall. Only someone standing very close would notice where the repair had been made. Across many frontier settlements, these small repairs continued all through the cold season. Cabins were not sealed once and forgotten. They were adjusted again and again, each time the weather shifted or the wood settled into a new position. Sometimes children helped with this work. They gathered moss from storage bundles or carried small pieces of clay mixture from one side of the room to the other. In this way, even the youngest members of a household learned how warmth stayed inside a cabin. They learned it not as a lesson, but as part of ordinary evening movement. You reach out and touch the repaired seam lightly. The clay is already beginning to firm against the colder air near the wall. Once fully dry, it will hold its place through many nights like this one. Near the lower edge of the wall, another older seam shows where similar work had been done earlier in the season. That section carries a slightly darker color, shaped weeks ago and left undisturbed since then. Each layer tells a quiet story about the changing weather outside. Families often remembered which parts of the wall needed attention first when winter returned the following year. In some cabins, additional fibers from animals were mixed into these seams for extra strength. Hair from horses or cattle was especially useful because it helped prevent the clay from cracking as it dried. This simple method had been used for generations in many regions, long before frontier settlements spread across the plains and forests of North America. People adopted what worked. They kept what kept warmth near them. The scent of damp earth near the repaired seam lingers faintly for a moment, before fading as the clay settles into place. It is a quiet reminder that the house itself is still changing, still adjusting, still responding to the cold outside. Beyond the window covering, the reflected brightness of the snow has softened even further now. Night has almost fully arrived. Inside the cabin, the fire continues to hold its steady shape, and the repaired seams along the walls help keep that warmth from wandering too quickly into the dark. Marta folds the cloth that held the clay mixture and sets it back on the shelf where it can be reached again if needed later in the night. She does not expect to use it again before morning, but she keeps it close, because winter walls are never entirely finished. They are watched, they are touched, they are cared for the way people care for the edges of their clothing when the weather turns colder. And as the last faint light outside the window disappears into the deeper blue of evening, the cabin holds its warmth a little more closely than it did before her hands passed along that narrow seam beside the frame. As the evening deepens and the last pale brightness fades from the snow outside, your attention begins to settle on the windows. They do not look like modern windows. In many frontier cabins, glass itself was thin, uneven, and sometimes absent altogether. Even when panes were present, they could not keep warmth inside by themselves. Cold air slipped easily along their edges, especially after nightfall, when the temperature fell more quickly than anyone could see. So families did not rely on glass alone. They dressed their windows the same way they dressed themselves. Marta stands beside one now, her hands moving slowly along the wooden frame. Earlier in the day, she pressed narrow strips of cloth into the smallest openings where the wood met the pane. These strips were often made from worn fabric saved carefully for winter use, soft enough to fit into thin seams, but strong enough to remain in place for many nights. This first layer was simple, but important. Even the smallest opening could allow a thin thread of cold air to travel quietly into the room. You move closer and notice how the edge of the window no longer feels sharp with cold the way it did before the cloth was placed there. The change is small, but steady. After the cloth came another layer. Across many settlements during the colder months, families stretched sheets of oiled paper over window openings once evening approached. The paper allowed light from the stove to pass through, but it slowed the movement of colder air It also softened the brightness coming from outside, turning the clearing beyond the cabin into a pale blur rather than a sharp outline of snow and trees. Now the paper glows gently in the firelight, its surface holding a faint amber color that seems warmer than the night beyond it. When the wind rose later in the season, this layer made an even greater difference. Air that might have slipped through the frame was slowed by the paper's surface, leaving the interior quieter and more still. Marta lifts the final covering now. It is a quilt, thick with layers of fabric stitched together earlier in the year when daylight was longer and hands were less stiff with cold. She raises it carefully and fastens it across the window frame with small wooden pegs set there for exactly this purpose. The change is immediate. The glow from outside disappears almost entirely, replaced by the softer light of the stove alone. The room feels closer now, not smaller in a troubling way, but more contained, as if the night has been gently asked to remain outside the walls. In many cabins, quilts like this were placed over windows only after the evening work was finished. During the day, they were folded away to allow as much sunlight as possible into the room. But once darkness settled, warmth mattered more than brightness. So the windows disappeared behind cloth. You reach out and place your hand lightly against the quilt. It holds the faintest trace of warmth from the room itself, rather than the sharper chill that glass alone would have carried. Layers like this slowed the movement of cold air in the same quiet way moss slowed it between the logs. Nothing here stopped the cold entirely, but each layer made the inside calmer. The effect spreads slowly across the room. Sound changes first. With the window covered, the distant openness of the clearing seems farther away. Even the small noises outside, the shifting of snow from a branch or the passing movement of night wind between trees, arrive more softly now. The cabin begins to feel wrapped in a gentle stillness that was not there earlier in the evening. Families often noticed this change without speaking about it. They simply recognized that once the windows were covered, the house had settled for the night. On the narrow shelf beneath the window, a small lamp remains unlit. Lamp oil is saved carefully during winter evenings, and there is no need to use it yet. The fire provides enough light for quiet movement across the room, especially now that the window coverings keep the glow from wandering outward into the dark. Beyond the quilt, the snow continues to reflect what little light remains in the sky. But inside the cabin, that brightness no longer reaches the walls. Instead, the stove becomes the center of everything. Marta presses one last corner of the quilt firmly into place and steps back to look across the room. The covered window blends into the wall now, no longer a separate opening, but part of the shelter itself. In settlements across the northern plains and forest edges during the late 1800s, people repeated this small evening habit without needing to explain it. Cloth, paper, and quilt together formed a quiet barrier that helped the warmth remain where it was needed most. You notice how the air near the window frame feels steadier now, no longer carrying the faint, restless movement that earlier brushed lightly against your sleeve. The house has changed again, not by building something new, but by adding one more careful layer between the family and the night outside. And as the last window disappears behind its covering, the cabin begins to feel smaller and warmer at once. By the time the windows have been covered and the walls carefully checked, the cabin has already changed in ways that are easy to feel but difficult to see. Warmth no longer moves through the room as quickly as it did earlier in the evening. Now it begins to settle. You notice this most clearly near the floor. In many frontier cabins, the wooden floor did not rest directly against the frozen ground. Instead, it stood slightly above it, lifted by short supports that allowed air to move beneath the structure. At first, this might seem like it would make the room colder, but in winter, this small space beneath the floor helped prevent the deeper chill of frozen earth from pressing directly upward into the living space. The difference was subtle, yet people learned to value it. When a cabin floor stood just high enough above the soil, the boards inside remained steadier in temperature through the night. The cold still reached them, but it arrived more slowly, giving the fire more time to keep the room comfortable. You shift your weight slightly and notice how the boards nearest the stove feel faintly warmer underfoot than those closer to the doorway. This gentle difference forms a quiet map across the room, one that everyone inside the cabin understands without needing to describe it. Above you, the roof plays its own part in holding warmth close. Many frontier roofs were layered with materials gathered from the land nearby. Grass sod, bark, or packed earth sometimes rested above the wooden structure, forming a soft covering that slowed the escape of rising heat. These materials did not stop warmth entirely from leaving the house, but they helped it remain longer than it otherwise would have. On still nights like this one, the effect could be felt clearly. The air near the ceiling remained calmer, less restless, as though the roof itself were holding a quiet conversation with the fire below. Cabin builders also paid close attention to the direction from which winter winds usually arrived. When possible, doorways faced toward the lower winter sunlight, rather than directly into the strongest cold winds. This meant that even on bright days in midwinter, a small amount of sunlight could reach the entrance, warming the threshold slightly before evening returned. It was not much warmth, but it was enough to matter. The wall facing the open clearing often received the strongest weather. Snow gathered more deeply there, and wind pressed more firmly against the logs. On the opposite side of the cabin, however, the air usually remained calmer. Families often placed storage spaces, small lean-to shelters, or stacked wood along that sheltered wall, creating an extra barrier between the living space and the moving air outside. You step closer to the door that leads toward the storage shed and notice how the latch resists slightly before opening. Thomas is already there, testing it with careful pressure. The metal has stiffened with frost that formed earlier in the evening, and he pushes the door once, then again, before it loosens with a quiet sound. He does not seem surprised. Latches often behaved this way once temperatures fell deeply after sunset. Checking them before sleep was another small habit that made the night easier. If a door froze completely shut by morning, reaching stored supplies could become slower and more difficult. So families tested these small things while the fire was still strong and movement around the cabin still easy. Beyond the door, a narrow, covered space holds extra tools and stacked fuel. In some settlements, families also kept animals close to the cabin walls during winter nights. The warmth from their bodies did not travel far, but even a small amount of shared heat helped soften the air around nearby structures. People noticed this effect without measuring it. They simply recognized that buildings standing close together often felt calmer in winter than buildings left alone in open ground. You close the storage door again and return toward the center of the room, where the stove continues its steady work. The air above the floorboards feels faintly warmer now than it did earlier, and the ceiling holds the rising heat more gently beneath the layered roof. Outside, the wind remains quiet. This stillness allows the careful design of the cabin to do its work more fully. Without moving air pulling warmth away, the walls, roof, and floor together form a quiet shelter that holds the fire's effort inside. Families across the frontier understood these things not as plans drawn on paper, but as habits shaped by experience. They built where the wind could not reach too easily, they lifted their floors slightly above the frozen soil. They covered their roofs with whatever materials the land provided. And when animals stood close to the outer walls during winter nights, they accepted that warmth as part of the same quiet system that helped everyone inside sleep more safely. Thomas tests the latch once more before stepping back from the door. Satisfied now, he brushes his hands together and returns toward the stove, where the circle of warmth still rests steadily across the floorboards. The cabin has closed itself carefully against the wind, and now, as the night deepens beyond the covered windows, everything inside begins to depend more fully on the fire that waits at its center. After the evening meal is finished and the last movements around the table begin to quiet, the fire changes its purpose. Earlier, it was bright and lively. It boiled water, warmed hands, dried damp cloth, and filled the cabin with enough light for work to continue even after sunset. But now the work of the fire becomes different. It is no longer meant to shine. It is meant to last. You notice the change first in the way Elias approaches the stove. He does not add wood quickly anymore. Instead, he lifts the stove door only slightly and looks inside without disturbing the coals too much. A steady bed of embers rests there now, glowing in deep shades of red and gold. This is the moment families waited for before preparing the fire for the long night ahead. A strong bed of embers could carry warmth through many hours if treated carefully. Elias reaches for a small metal scoop and gathers a thin layer of pale ash from the edge of the stove's interior. With slow movements, he spreads it lightly across part of the glowing surface. The change is gentle but deliberate. Ash slows the movement of air across the embers, allowing them to burn more slowly and steadily. Across many frontier cabins, this was one of the quiet habits that made winter nights safer. Covering part of the embers with ash did not put the fire out. It helped the fire wait. The glow beneath the ash softens slightly, becoming less bright but more patient, as though the warmth has settled deeper into the stove rather than rising quickly toward the chimney. You shift closer and feel how the air in the room changes as the fire settles into this slower rhythm. The heat no longer arrives in strong bursts. Instead, it spreads gradually, like warmth from a pot left gently simmering beside the edge of a stove. Families depended on this slower heat once they prepared to sleep. Logs added too quickly at this stage could burn away before midnight. Logs added too late could leave the room cooler than expected before morning. So the evening fire required attention not only to strength, but to timing. Elias reaches for one of the heavier pieces of wood Thomas placed earlier within easy reach. He sets it carefully across the embers rather than dropping it directly onto them. The placement matters. A log resting too tightly against the coals might burn too quickly. One placed with a little space beneath it would catch more slowly and last longer. This kind of arrangement came from experience rather than instruction. People learned it by watching the fire night after night, noticing which placements allowed warmth to continue quietly while everyone slept. The stove door closes again with a soft sound, but it does not close completely. A narrow opening remains, just wide enough to allow a small amount of air to continue feeding the embers. Too much air would cause the wood to burn quickly. Too little would weaken the coals before morning arrived. Finding the right balance was part of the evening routine in cabins across the northern plains and forest settlements during the late 1800s. You listen for a moment and notice how the fire answers this adjustment. Its sound changes. Earlier it spoke in quick movements and sharper crackles. Now it settles into a slower voice, steady and even, like something breathing quietly in the corner of the room. Across the floorboards, the warmth spreads outward from the stove in a calm circle. Beyond that circle, the cooler air near the walls remains still, but no longer feels as sharp as it did before the embers were arranged. This is the moment when the fire becomes a companion rather than a tool. Elias remains beside the stove a little longer, watching the glow through the small opening before lowering himself into his chair. He does not hurry away. No one does. The first minutes after arranging the embers are important. Families often stayed nearby until they were certain the fire had settled into its slower rhythm. Only then did they begin preparing for sleep. In some settlements, people spoke quietly about how a well-tended evening fire could remain alive until morning without needing more than a single careful adjustment during the night. This was never guaranteed, of course. Storms, sudden winds, or unexpected cold sometimes changed everything. But careful attention made success more likely. You glance once more toward the stove and notice how the ash has already begun doing its work. The embers glow more softly now, their brightness hidden beneath a thin, pale layer that keeps them from fading too quickly. Nothing dramatic has happened. And yet the room feels safer. Outside the covered windows, the snow continues to reflect the faintest trace of distant starlight across the clearing. Inside the cabin, the fire has become quieter than it was before supper, but it has also become more dependable. It is no longer meant to shine brightly. It is meant to remain. And as the household settles into the slower movements that come before sleep, the embers wait patiently, holding their warmth for the hours no one will see. Somewhere deep in the night, long after the last movements of evening have settled into stillness, the fire changes again. It does not disappear, but it grows quieter. You wake only slightly at first, not fully aware of why. The room has not become cold exactly. Instead, the warmth has shifted. The steady presence of the fire feels thinner now, like a blanket pulled just a little farther from your shoulders. This is the hour when embers must be asked gently to return. Across many frontier cabins, someone in the household learned to listen for this moment even while half asleep. It was not always the same person each night. Sometimes it was a parent, sometimes an older child, sometimes whoever happened to stir first beneath the blankets. Tonight, Thomas moves before anyone else does. He rises quietly, pulling his wool stockings tighter before crossing the short distance to the stove. The boards beneath his feet feel cooler here than they did earlier in the evening, but the circle of warmth around the hearth still remains. He kneels beside the stove door and opens it only a little. Inside, the fire has not gone out. A bed of embers still glows beneath its thin covering of pale ash, their light faint but steady. This is exactly what the household hoped for when Elias prepared the stove before sleep. The embers have waited, just as they were meant to. Thomas does not add wood immediately. Instead, he leans closer and watches the coals for a moment. Across the northern plains and forest settlements of the late 1800s, people learned that the first movement mattered most. Adding wood too quickly could smother the quiet heat that still remained. Moving too slowly could allow the embers to weaken before they were ready to grow again. So he begins with breath. He blows gently across the surface of the ash, not strongly, but slowly and steadily, as if encouraging something living to wake rather than forcing it to move. The ash shifts slightly, and beneath it, the red glow brightens almost at once. This change is small, but unmistakable. A coal that brightens under breath is ready to accept kindling. Thomas reaches for the thinnest sticks placed nearby earlier in the evening. Their position beside the stove was not accidental. Wood left within the warmer part of the room remains easier to light than wood taken from colder corners near the walls. He lays the first stick across the glowing coals with a careful hand, leaving space beneath it so air can continue to move. The second stick follows at a slight angle, forming a narrow opening between them. This small structure matters. Air must be able to travel between the sticks if the flame is to return. People sometimes describe this arrangement as building a small doorway for the fire to pass through. Without that space, the flame could struggle before it fully appeared. You watch as Thomas leans closer again and breathes once more across the embers. The glow strengthens further now, spreading slowly along the edge of the nearest stick. For a moment, nothing else happens. Then a thin line of flame rises. It does not leap, it unfolds. Across the room, the warmth begins to return almost immediately, though only slightly at first. The fire is still young again, still gathering strength. Thomas waits before adding anything larger. This waiting is part of the habit. Kindling must be allowed to take hold before heavier wood is introduced. Once the smallest sticks burn steadily, he reaches for a slightly thicker piece and places it across them with the same careful spacing as before. The flame answers more quickly this time. Soon the stove holds a quiet but growing fire once again, strong enough to carry warmth through another long stretch of darkness without needing further attention. Thomas closes the stove door gently, leaving just enough space for air to continue feeding the flame. Then he remains where he is for a few moments, watching the light settle into its steady shape. Families often stayed beside the stove briefly after rekindling the fire like this, not because they expected trouble, but because certainty brought rest. Once the flame showed that it would continue on its own, they could return to their blankets without worry. Outside the covered windows, the clearing rests in complete stillness now. Snow reflects only the faintest trace of starlight across the ground. Inside the cabin, the renewed fire spreads warmth slowly outward again, reaching the edges of the room that had begun to cool. Thomas stands and returns quietly to his place beside the others. By morning, no one will speak about this moment. It is simply part of the night's work, as ordinary as turning in sleep or pulling a blanket closer to your shoulders. Yet without it, the cold would have moved farther into the room before dawn arrived. Sometimes the difference between a fading ember and a steady flame is nothing more than one careful breath offered at the right time. Some warmth in a frontier cabin came directly from the fire, and some warmth came from what the fire left behind. Even after the flames settled into quieter embers, the stove itself continued to hold heat for many hours. Iron and stone warmed slowly while the fire was strong. And just as slowly, they released that warmth back into the room after the flames softened. Families learned to make careful use of this lingering heat, especially during the coldest stretch of night before morning. One of the simplest ways they did this was with stones. Earlier in the evening, before anyone prepared for sleep, smooth stones were sometimes placed near the edge of the stove, where they could warm gradually without becoming too hot to handle. These stones were chosen carefully. They needed to be dense enough to hold warmth, but not so brittle that they might crack when heated. Over time, households learned which stones worked best. Once warmed, the stones were wrapped in cloth and carried quietly to the sleeping area. There they rested near feet or beside folded blankets, releasing their stored warmth slowly through the long hours of darkness. You notice one such bundle now resting near the edge of a bed. The cloth around it is thick enough to soften the heat, but thin enough to allow warmth to pass through. This balance mattered. A stone placed without wrapping could be uncomfortable against the skin, while a stone wrapped too heavily would release its warmth too slowly to be useful before morning. So families adjusted the layers by touch, rather than measurement. Marta kneels beside the sleeping place and checks the cloth bundle gently with her hand. Satisfied with its warmth, she shifts it slightly closer to a pair of boots resting near the blankets. Leather stiffened quickly in deep cold, and placing a warm bundle nearby helped keep the boots flexible enough for early morning use. This small habit saved time and effort later, when the first steps outside the cabin often came before sunrise. Across the northern frontier, warmed stones served many purposes like this. Some rested near bedding, others were placed beneath folded garments that needed to dry overnight. Still others were used to keep small containers of water from freezing before morning. None of these uses required special tools, only attention. The stove itself remained part of this quiet system long after the flames grew low. Its iron surface continued to release warmth slowly, creating a gentle circle of comfort that lingered across the floorboards. Families often placed damp mittens or stockings nearby so they would be ready again by morning. You notice a pair of wool socks resting near the stove leg now, their shape softened by the returning warmth. Earlier in the evening they carried a trace of snow from outside. Now they are nearly dry again, ready for the next journey beyond the doorway. This steady exchange between fire and fabric formed part of the nightly rhythm inside many cabins. Nothing was wasted. Even the smallest trace of warmth was carried where it could be useful. Beyond the stove, the embers continue their slow breathing. They no longer shine brightly, but they still hold enough strength to keep the iron warm. In this way, the fire continues working even after it appears to rest. You move closer and feel how the air near the hearthstones remains softer than the rest of the room. It is not the strong warmth of earlier evening. It is quieter now, more patient, like light from a distant star that reaches the ground long after the sun has set. Families depended on this patience during the coldest hours before dawn. The cloth-wrapped stone near the bed releases its warmth gradually, just as the stove releases its own stored heat into the room. Together, they form a second kind of fire, one that does not flicker or crackle but continues silently through the night. Marta finishes adjusting the bundle near the boots and pauses for a moment before returning to her place beside the others. She does not need to check the stove again. The embers are steady. The stones are warm. The blankets hold their shape. Everything is ready to carry the household through the remaining hours of darkness. Outside the covered windows, the snow reflects a faint silver light beneath the quiet sky. Inside the cabin, warmth moves slowly from iron to stone, from stone to cloth, and from cloth to sleeping hands and feet. The fire itself may rest, but the warmth it created continues traveling gently through the room, lasting longer than the flames that first made it. By the time the night reaches its deepest stillness, the cabin grows quieter than it has been at any point since evening. The fire no longer speaks in bright crackles. The floorboards no longer carry footsteps. Even the wind outside seems to pause between the trees. It is during these hours, when almost nothing appears to move, that listening becomes most important. Frontier families did not always wake fully to check the fire. Often they listened instead. Small sounds inside the cabin carried meaning, and over time people learned to recognize them without opening their eyes. You lie still beneath the blankets and begin to notice how many quiet voices remain in the room. The stove speaks first. As the iron slowly releases the warmth it gathered earlier in the evening, It makes a faint sound now and then. A soft, clear note, almost like a single tap of metal against metal. These sounds were familiar in cabins across the northern plains and forest settlements during the late 1800s. They marked the slow change of temperature within the stove itself as it cooled. Families listened for these sounds without worry. They meant the fire had done its work well, but silence from the stove could mean something different. If the iron stopped speaking too soon, it sometimes meant the embers beneath had faded faster than expected. In that case, someone might rise to check the coals before the room cooled further. Elias shifts slightly beside the wall, but does not open his eyes. He is listening. Across many winter households, this kind of listening became part of sleep itself. People rested, but they remained aware of the small signals around them. They did not think of this as watchfulness. It was simply the way sleep changed when warmth depended on a single stove. Near the doorway, another faint sound travels across the room. A hinge settles slowly as the wood around it contracts in the cold. The change is almost too small to hear unless the room is already quiet. But once you notice it, the meaning becomes clear. Temperatures outside have fallen again since midnight. Doors often spoke this way before morning. Families learned to listen for the difference between a hinge shifting gently and one stiffening too quickly. A hinge that moved sharply sometimes meant frost had begun to gather more heavily along the outer frame. That knowledge helped people prepare before sunrise arrived. You turn slightly beneath the blankets and notice another change. Somewhere along the wall, a thin movement of air brushes lightly against the edge of a hanging cloth. It is not strong enough to be called wind. It is only a small current moving through a place where wood has shifted slightly since evening. During the coldest weeks of winter, cabins often changed shape in very small ways overnight. Logs tightened as temperatures fell. Seams narrowed or opened by a fraction too small to see clearly in darkness. But people could hear these changes. Sometimes they sounded like a faint sigh moving through the wall. Marta shifts once on the far side of the room, pulling a blanket closer without waking fully. The cloth makes a soft sound against the bedding. Even this movement becomes part of the night's quiet language. Outside the covered windows, the snow settles slowly from a branch somewhere beyond the clearing. The sound is gentle and distant, like a hand brushing across dry paper. Fresh snow often moved this way when the air grew colder toward morning. Families who lived many winters in one place learned to recognize even these sounds. Snow settling heavily could mean a change in weather before dawn. Light settling often meant the cold would remain steady until sunrise. The stove speaks again. Another soft note of cooling iron reaches across the room, steady and calm. Elias hears it and relaxes slightly beneath his blanket. The embers are still alive. The warmth is still present. There is no need to rise. In cabins like this one, people did not watch clocks during the night. They listened instead. They listened to the stove, to the hinges, to the walls, and sometimes to the snow itself. These sounds formed a kind of quiet music that told them how the night was passing and whether the morning would arrive gently or with sharper cold. You begin to understand how this listening replaced many of the tools people use today. There were no instruments measuring temperature beside the bed, no lamps left burning through the night to check the room. Only the steady presence of the fire and the small voices of wood and iron answering the cold outside. Another moment passes. The stove settles once more into silence. That silence, too, has meaning. It tells the household that the embers remain strong enough for now, that the walls still hold their warmth, and that the night can continue undisturbed a little longer. Elias breathes slowly and does not move again. He is still listening, but he no longer needs to wake. Long before anyone lies down for the night, there is one more quiet preparation that takes place inside the cabin. It happens not at the stove and not along the walls. It happens in the way people dress. In many frontier households, sleep did not begin by removing clothing. It began by adding it. Warmth inside the cabin depended not only on the fire and the walls, but also on the careful layering of fabric that could travel with a person even after the embers grew quiet. You notice this first in the way stockings are handled. No one leaves their feet uncovered here once night deepens. Wool stockings are pulled higher before blankets are drawn close, sometimes doubled if the cold is expected to grow sharper before morning. Wool holds warmth differently from lighter cloth. Even when the air cools, it continues to keep a small pocket of comfort close to the skin. Families across the northern plains and wooded frontier regions depended on wool for exactly this reason. It remained useful even when the night became colder than expected. Cotton, by contrast, was used more carefully during winter sleep. Cotton could feel comfortable at first, but it did not protect warmth in the same steady way once the air cooled. So people often placed wool above lighter garments, allowing the stronger fabric to hold warmth longer through the darker hours before sunrise. You shift slightly beneath the blankets and notice how the layers around you move together rather than separately. This was not accidental. Clothing worn to sleep was chosen with the same care as wood arranged beside the stove earlier in the evening. Each layer had its place. Near the edge of the bed, a folded wool shawl rests within reach. It waits quietly there in case someone wakes and feels the air change before morning. Adding one more layer could be done without leaving the blankets, and that small convenience mattered during long winter nights. Marta reaches for another piece of fabric now, lifting it carefully from a nearby chair. It is not heavy enough to be called a blanket, but thicker than ordinary clothing. She folds it once more before placing it beside the sleeping place where it can be found easily later. These extra layers were not arranged randomly. They were placed where half-awake hands could reach them without searching. Across many frontier cabins, clothing followed the same careful logic as firewood and kindling. Everything needed during the night remained within the warmer part of the room and within the reach of someone still wrapped in sleep. You notice, too, that garments worn during the day are not always removed before rest begins. A dress might remain over a lighter night layer. A shirt might stay beneath a wool outer garment. Removing too many layers meant losing warmth already gathered during the evening beside the stove. So people kept what warmth they had earned. Even boots sometimes remained close enough to the stove to stay flexible for morning use, as you saw earlier in the evening. Clothing followed the same principle. Nothing that could hold warmth was set aside without reason. Near the stove leg, a pair of mittens rests quietly, drying from earlier contact with snow. By morning, they will be ready again, softened by the steady warmth that continues to travel outward from the iron surface. This steady exchange between fire and fabric formed part of the nightly rhythm inside the cabin. Warmth moved through the room not only as air, but as cloth. Children learned these habits early. They were taught to pull stockings higher before sleep and to keep an extra layer nearby even if they did not think they would need it. Over time, these small movements became as natural as drawing a blanket closer or turning toward the warmer side of the bed. Across settlements scattered through colder regions of North America during the late 1800s, such habits made winter nights quieter and safer. No one depended on a single source of warmth. Instead, Warmth was shared between the stove, the walls, the blankets, and the clothing itself. Marta settles back beside the others now and smooths the folded wool once more with her hand before closing her eyes. She does not expect to use it before morning, but she leaves it where it can be reached. Because warmth in a cabin like this is something you prepare in advance rather than search for later. Outside the covered windows, the snow continues to reflect a faint silver brightness beneath the still sky. Inside, the layered clothing beneath the blankets holds the last of the evening's warmth, close to sleeping shoulders and feet. And as the fire settles into its quieter rhythm once again, you begin to understand that warmth here is not something that comes from one place alone. It is woven together from many small pieces, just like the fabric resting beside the bed. After the last extra layers of wool have been folded within reach and the blankets drawn closer around resting shoulders, the room settles into another quieter arrangement that no one announces but everyone understands. Sleep does not happen randomly inside a winter cabin. It follows warmth. You begin to notice this as the household grows still. The stove continues its slow breathing near the center of the room, and the warmth it releases spreads outward in a soft circle across the floorboards. Closest to that circle, the air feels gentler. Farther away, near the outer walls, the cold remains patient but less sharp than it was earlier in the evening. Families learned to read this invisible map without needing to speak about it. They slept according to it. Children were often placed near the wall that faced the stove, rather than the wall that faced the open clearing outside. That inner side of the room held warmth longer through the night. Even a small difference mattered during the coldest hours before morning. You watch as one blanket shifts slightly, then settles again. Thomas turns once in his sleep, not fully waking, and moves a little closer toward the warmer side of the wall. The movement is small and natural, the kind that happens without thought. Over many winters, bodies learned where warmth rested and followed it without being told. This quiet adjustment was common in frontier households across the northern plains and wooded settlements during the late 1800s. People did not sleep in fixed positions simply because beds were placed there. They slept where warmth remained most dependable. Infants were often kept closer to the center of shared sleeping spaces, where heat from several bodies gathered together beneath the blankets. This central position protected them from the colder edges of the room and allowed their breathing to remain steadier through the night. Such arrangements were not unusual. They were practical. You notice how the air near the stove wall holds warmth a little longer than the rest of the cabin. Earlier in the evening, breath might have appeared as pale clouds across the room when someone spoke or shifted beneath the blankets. Now those faint clouds fade more quickly near the hearth side, disappearing almost as soon as they appear. This difference is small, but it is enough. Across many winter cabins, families used shared sleeping spaces not only because space was limited, but because shared warmth helped the fire do its work more effectively. Blankets layered together held heat more steadily than blankets used alone. Bodies resting close together formed another quiet circle of warmth within the larger circle created by the stove. In this way, sleep itself became part of the household's winter preparation. You shift slightly beneath your own blanket and feel how the air changes as you move closer to the warmer side of the room. The difference is gentle but unmistakable. Even without opening your eyes, you can tell where the fire's influence reaches most easily. Along the outer wall, the logs still hold traces of the day's cold, though the moss and clay pressed between them earlier in the evening continue to slow its movement. Near the stove wall, the warmth lingers more steadily, spreading through blankets and clothing alike. Families noticed this pattern long before anyone tried to describe it. They simply arranged themselves accordingly. Across fur trade settlements and prairie homesteads alike, travelers recorded similar sleeping arrangements during winter visits. Children were placed where warmth gathered most reliably. Adults often rested closer to the edges of shared bedding, where they could rise more easily if the stove required attention during the night. Even the direction someone faced while sleeping sometimes followed the same quiet logic. Turning toward the warmer wall allowed breath to settle more comfortably beneath blankets, rather than drifting outward into colder air near the doorway. These small choices made winter nights calmer. They allowed sleep to continue longer without interruption. Somewhere beyond the covered windows, the clearing remains silent beneath its thin silver reflection of starlight. Inside the cabin, the stove continues releasing its stored warmth in slow, patient waves that reach the edges of the sleeping space one layer at a time. Thomas shifts once more beside the wall, pulling his blanket slightly closer before settling again into stillness. He does not wake. He does not need to. His body has already learned where warmth rests. Across the room, the shared bedding holds its quiet shape, gathering warmth from blankets, clothing, and the steady breathing of everyone beneath them. No one speaks. No one moves very far. The cabin itself seems to grow calmer as the household settles into its final arrangement for the night. Even sleep here follows the map of warmth inside the room. As the cabin settles deeper into the stillness that comes after everyone has found their place beneath the blankets, another small source of warmth begins its quiet work without needing to be invited. It arrives on 4 careful paws. The dog moves slowly across the floorboards, pausing once near the stove before circling toward the sleeping space. Its steps are soft enough not to disturb anyone, yet familiar enough that no one inside the cabin would mistake the sound for anything else. In many frontier households, this movement was part of the night's rhythm, as ordinary as the settling of the embers or the faint shifting of blankets. Animals belonged to the warmth of the cabin as surely as people did. You notice how the dog chooses its place with care. It does not lie directly beside the stove. That space is too warm and too bright. Instead, it curls beside the edge of a blanket near a pair of small boots resting close to the sleeping place. The leather holds a trace of earlier warmth from the cloth bundle placed nearby before midnight. The blankets hold the steady warmth of breathing bodies. Between those two sources, the dog settles into a narrow space where its own heat will remain useful through the remaining hours before dawn. Across many settlements during the colder decades of the late 1800s, animals sleeping near family members during winter nights were not unusual. Dogs, especially, often rested beside children or along the outer edges of shared bedding where colder air gathered more easily. Their warmth mattered. Even a small animal's body heat helped slow the cooling of blankets near the floor. Over time, families came to depend on this quiet contribution without needing to speak about it directly. The dog turns once, then again, shaping its body into a small circle that fits naturally against the curve of the blankets. This movement is instinctive, but it follows the same pattern people themselves have already used while settling into sleep. Warmth gathers best when space is closed gently rather than left open. Nearby, the youngest child shifts slightly but does not wake. The boots remain close to the dog's side, their leather kept flexible by the warmth of cloth and fur resting around them. In winter cabins, objects placed near sleeping bodies often shared in this exchange of warmth. Nothing was left entirely alone if it could be kept ready for morning. Blankets themselves formed another quiet layer in this system. Many frontier households relied on thick coverings made from wool, woven cloth, or animal hides prepared earlier in the year. Buffalo robes were especially valued across prairie regions. Sheepskins and deer hides served similar purposes in wooded areas where those animals were more easily obtained. These coverings held warmth differently from lighter fabrics, releasing it slowly rather than all at once. You reach beneath one edge of a blanket and feel how the air there remains softer than the air beyond it. This softness is not only from the stove, it comes from the gathering of many small sources of warmth layered together. Cloth holds heat, fur holds heat, breathing bodies hold heat, and now the dog's steady warmth joins them. Across the northern frontier, travelers sometimes remarked on how quietly animals became part of household winter routines. A dog resting beside a doorway could help slow the movement of colder air across the floor. One lying near shared bedding could help keep blankets warm along their outer edges. None of these roles required training. They developed naturally over seasons spent together in the same small spaces. The dog lifts its head once, listening briefly to the quiet sounds of the cabin, then settles again with a slow breath that matches the rhythm of the sleepers nearby. Outside the covered windows, the clearing remains still beneath the faint silver light of the night sky. Snow holds its quiet brightness across the ground, and the trees beyond the cabin stand motionless in the colder air before morning. Inside, the warmth gathered beneath blankets continues its slow work. The stove releases what heat it still carries. The walls hold what warmth they can. The clothing layered earlier in the evening keeps its careful place close to the skin. And now the small circle of fur resting beside the boots adds one more gentle source of comfort to the room. No one speaks. No one needs to move. The dog sleeps lightly beside the child, its breathing steady and calm, as though it understands its place within the shape of the household's warmth. Sometimes the smallest warmth in the room is also the most dependable. Long before the first hint of morning light reaches the snow beyond the covered windows, someone inside the cabin wakes again. Not fully, not with urgency, but with the quiet attention that comes from long practice. Marta opens her eyes only slightly, listening first before she moves. The stove still holds its steady warmth. The breathing around her remains slow and even. No one else has stirred. Still, she shifts carefully beneath the blankets and rises just enough to reach the edge of the sleeping space. Across many frontier households, during the colder decades of the late 1800s, this kind of movement happened often without being noticed by anyone else in the room. It was part of the night's work, though no one called it work. It was simply care. She reaches first for the blanket nearest the youngest sleeper and draws it a little closer toward the stove-facing side of the bedding. Earlier in the night, the warmth there was stronger. Now, as the embers settle further into their quiet rhythm, the balance of warmth has shifted slightly across the room. Small adjustments like this helped sleep continue without interruption. Children rarely woke when blankets were moved this gently. Over time, they became used to these quiet corrections. The same way they became used to the sound of the stove or the settling of the walls during colder hours. Marta pauses and listens again. Near the window, a faint change in the air catches her attention. She moves slowly across the floorboards, keeping close to the warmer edge of the room as she goes. When she reaches the window covering, she lifts one corner of the quilt just enough to touch the glass beneath. A thin line of frost has begun to form along the inner edge. This was not unusual. On colder nights, even well-covered windows sometimes gathered frost, where outside air pressed most strongly against the frame. Families learn to check these places without needing light. The feel of the surface beneath the fingertips was enough to tell them what the night was doing outside. Satisfied that the frost has not spread further, she lowers the quilt again and presses its edge firmly back into place. The room remains still. Near the stove, another quiet task waits. Earlier in the evening, damp stockings were placed close enough to the iron surface to dry before morning. Now she reaches down and turns them once so the warmer side faces outward. This small movement helps them finish drying evenly without needing stronger heat. Across many cabins, textiles were cared for this way through the night. Dry clothing meant warmer mornings. She glances briefly toward the shelf where the lamp rests. It remains unlit. Lamp oil was never used without reason during winter months. Every drop mattered, especially during long stretches of weather when travel between settlements became difficult. Instead of lighting the lamp, she waits until her eyes adjust to the dim glow still resting near the stove. That is enough. Families often depended on this remaining light, rather than spending precious fuel before sunrise. She steps back toward the sleeping space and pauses beside the wood placed earlier within easy reach of the stove. Only one piece has been used since midnight. The rest remain ready if needed before morning. She touches the nearest stick lightly, not to move it, but to be certain it has not shifted out of place. Even this small check brings reassurance. Across the room, the dog lifts its head once, and then settles again beside the child's boots. The shared warmth beneath the blankets has held its shape through the deeper hours of the night. Marta returns to her place quietly and draws the edge of the blanket closer around her shoulders. Before closing her eyes again, she listens once more to the stove. Its sound is steady. That is enough to let her rest. Across frontier settlements from wooded river valleys to open prairie homesteads, women carried much of this quiet responsibility through winter nights. They checked window coverings, watched the drying of clothing, adjusted blankets, and measured the strength of the fire, not by sight, but by sound and touch. None of these movements were large, yet each one helped the household remain warm until morning. You settle again beneath the blankets and feel how the room has changed slightly since she moved across it. The warmth near the bedding has steadied. The air near the window feels calmer again. Even the socks beside the stove now rest in their proper place. Outside, the snow reflects a faint, pale brightness that does not yet belong to sunrise, but no longer belongs entirely to night. Long before daylight arrives, someone in the house has already been listening for it. Before the sun fully rises above the trees, the cabin begins to change again. Not suddenly, but gradually, as the long night loosens its hold. The faint silver light that rested on the snow through the darkest hours now begins to shift toward a softer blue. The stove still breathes quietly behind you. Blankets still hold their warmth, yet something outside has already begun moving. Morning on the frontier often started not with words, but with listening. Somewhere beyond the covered window, a distant sound travels across the clearing. It is not wind. It is not snow falling from a branch. It is the careful step of someone walking across the frozen ground where a narrow path had been covered during the night. Storms often erased those paths. Morning restored them. Elias rises slowly and pulls his wool coat closer around his shoulders before stepping toward the door. He does not leave at once. First he listens, the same way he listened to the stove during the night. Only when he is certain the household remains warm and steady does he lift the latch and open the door. Cold air enters briefly, clean and sharp. carrying with it the quiet brightness of early daylight. Outside, the clearing looks unchanged at first glance. Snow rests evenly across the ground. The trees stand still. Smoke rises slowly from another cabin beyond the edge of the field. That smoke is important. Across many frontier settlements in the northern plains during the late 1800s, morning smoke told neighbors that the night had passed safely. A chimney without smoke sometimes meant a household needed help. So people learned to notice these small signals before beginning their own day's work. Elias steps carefully into the clearing, following the faint outline of a path that has already been pressed once before him. Someone else has walked this way earlier, perhaps checking another neighbor farther down the ridge. These paths formed quiet connections between households, scattered across wide stretches of winter land. They were not roads, they were lifelines. Snow gathers easily across open ground during the night, covering yesterday's tracks and hiding the direction of travel. So each morning, people walked again between cabins, pressing new paths into the surface so movement remained possible if weather changed later in the day. You follow a few steps behind Elias and notice how the snow beneath your boots carries a firmer sound now than it did the evening before. The colder hours before sunrise often hardened the surface just enough to make travel easier for a short time after dawn. This was the best moment for visiting neighbors. Ahead, another cabin stands partly sheltered by trees along the edge of the clearing. Its chimney releases a thin line of smoke that drifts slowly into the pale sky. Elias walks toward it without hurry, his steps steady and familiar. Morning visits like this were not unusual. Families checked one another after difficult nights, especially when temperatures fell lower than expected or when wind had moved strongly across the settlement. Sometimes these visits lasted only a few moments. A lifted hand, a few quiet words, a glance at the doorway to be sure everything remained well. Often that was enough. Fuel, too, was shared when needed. Woodpiles were not always equal from one household to the next. A family with extra might pass several pieces across the path to another whose supply had grown thinner during a long storm. Grain stores were sometimes measured the same way, especially late in winter when travel to distant trading posts became uncertain. These exchanges did not feel unusual, they felt necessary. Across prairie settlements and wooded river valleys alike, winter survival depended not on a single cabin standing alone, but on many cabins connected by small daily movements like these. Paths between houses carried warmth the way streams carry water across frozen ground, linking one household's strength to another's. You reach the neighboring cabin just as its door opens. A figure steps outside, lifting a hand in quiet greeting. No long conversation follows. None is needed. The smoke from the chimney tells its story clearly enough. The night has passed safely here as well. Farther across the clearing, another narrow trail appears, where someone else has already walked between two distant homes. By mid-morning, these paths will cross the settlement in several directions, connecting woodpiles, wells, storage sheds, and kitchens in a network shaped by shared necessity rather than formal planning. Elias turns back toward the cabin once he is certain all is well nearby. His footprints join the earlier ones, pressing the path more firmly into place for the next traveler who may follow later in the day. Behind him, the settlement begins to wake. Somewhere beyond the trees, the faint sound of an axe reaches across the snow, steady and unhurried. Another chimney begins to breathe. Another door opens briefly to the morning air. By daylight, you begin to see that no family truly faced winter alone. By the time the pale blue of morning spreads fully across the clearing, The cabin no longer feels like a place that has simply survived the night. It feels like a place that remembers how to do it again. The stove still holds a trace of warmth. The blankets carry the shape of where people rested. The paths between cabins now show fresh footprints pressed into the snow. All of these are signs not only of one night passed safely, but of knowledge carried quietly from one winter to the next. You begin to notice how much of what happened during the night was never spoken aloud. No one explained how to place the kindling beside the stove before sleep. No one described the exact distance a quilt should hang across the window. No one measured how close the dog should curl beside the boots, or where the warmest place for a child might be found beneath the blankets. Yet everyone knew. Across frontier settlements of the northern plains and wooded river valleys during the late 1800s, winter knowledge traveled in this way. It passed through hands rather than pages. Children watched, repeated, and remembered long before they understood the reasons behind what they were doing. Thomas kneels beside the woodpile now just outside the cabin door, turning several pieces of firewood slowly in his hands before stacking them near the entrance. He does not test them by sight alone. He feels their weight, their dryness, and the roughness of their surfaces before deciding where each piece belongs. This habit did not begin today. He learned it years earlier by watching his father do the same thing on mornings much like this one. Some wood catches quickly, some burns slowly, some is best saved for the hours just before dawn when the cold reaches its deepest point. Over time, these differences became as familiar to him as the shape of the path between cabins. Nearby, another child steps carefully across the snow and pauses to listen before scooping up a small handful from the surface. The sound it makes beneath the mittened fingers is faint but clear. Loose snow speaks differently from snow that has already hardened in the night air. Families often judged whether snow would pack well for walking or melt easily for water by listening to these small sounds. Such listening was part of learning winter itself. Long before printed guides reached distant settlements, people relied on what they could observe together. They noticed the color of morning light across the clearing. They watched how smoke rose from chimneys in different weather. They learned how frost gathered along window edges and how wind changed direction before storms arrived. Much of this knowledge came not only from settlers, but from the indigenous communities who had lived through northern winters for generations before frontier cabins appeared across these landscapes. Travelers' journals from the 18th century, including those of Samuel Hearne, describe learning how to judge snow conditions, travel safely across frozen ground, and prepare clothing suited to extreme cold by watching and working alongside Indigenous guides. Museums today, including the Canadian Museum of History, continue to preserve records of these exchanges, showing how practical winter knowledge moved quietly between cultures through shared experience rather than formal instruction. Inside the cabin, Marta lifts one of the blankets and folds it carefully before placing it near the wall where it can dry fully in the daylight. Even this small movement carries memory within it. She folds the blanket the same way she has folded it through many winters before, following patterns she learned from her own mother long ago. These habits do not fade easily. They remain, even when the seasons change. Across the clearing, the network of paths between cabins grows clearer as more people step outside to begin the day. Footprints overlap and cross one another, connecting doorways, woodpiles, wells, and storage sheds in quiet lines that show how closely winter survival depended on shared movement rather than isolation. You pause beside the doorway and look once more across the snow. Everything you have seen through the night now begins to gather into a single understanding. The fire was not enough on its own. The walls were not enough. The blankets, the clothing, the animals, the neighbors, and the listening were not separate skills. They belonged together. Families who lived through winters like this did not rely on one method alone. They relied on a language made from many small actions repeated until they became natural. A quilt placed across a window. A stone warmed beside the stove. A path pressed into fresh snow between cabins before sunrise. Thomas finishes arranging the wood beside the door and pauses for a moment. Looking across the clearing where smoke continues to rise from neighboring roofs, he does not need to think about what he will do tonight when darkness returns. He already knows. You begin to understand that surviving winter was never a single skill. It was a language everyone in the house quietly spoke together.